So, why is it so difficult to change? We want to change. We keep on doing the things that we don't want to do. This is what St. Paul says in Romans chapter 6. The very thing that I do not want to do, I keep doing. And then he goes on to say, who will rescue me from this body of death? It's a picture of a Roman torture where the dead body of somebody you murdered would be strung to your back. You can imagine walking down the street with an arm hanging over you like this with every step. What a terrible image, but that's how it feels sometimes. When we have problems in our lives, when we have issues in our lives that are difficult to overcome. They might not be addictions. They could be always seeing the negative about things. It could be constant anxiety or depression or sadness and melancholy. Whatever it is, sometimes it just feels like we're carrying a dead body on our back, and we wonder how we're going to overcome this. And even Christians struggle with this. The difficult thing is that, Christians are promised this great life as we read through the scriptures, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And yet, that seems to be so difficult to do. How do I renew my mind? We're going to be talking a lot more about that in this channel. But this is fundamentally the problem. The entire Christian path is about renewing our mind. And it turns out that's not quite as easy as we would like to think, especially if we come from a background that includes trauma, if it includes, a family history that's messy, then it's a lot harder to change. We find behaviors and attitudes and problems very deeply embedded in our lives. It becomes part of our wetware. A computer has software. Well, up here in your brain, you have wetware, neurons that are all connected together that, basically form the patterns and habits and insights that we have. There's a lot going on up there. And there are parts of the brain that are all assigned different tasks. And they're all participating in this process of transformation, more or less. Some of them more, some of them less. With your rational mind, you think about all of the change that you want, but with your emotional mind and with the parts of your brain that govern your bodily systems, your hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis, all of these things, these lower parts of the brain want what they want, even if the higher parts of your brain want more. And maybe this is what Paul is talking about. The very thing I do not want to do, I do. And the very thing I do, I do not want to do. Well, this references habit loops and all sorts of self-sabotage. So how do we begin to escape this? Well, there are a lot of things that we could do. One of the things that we're going to talk about, and I suppose what I would be introducing here, is something that I would call, and others like Dr. Andrew Newberg call, neurospirituality. And what that means is that the spiritual life or religious life actually changes and helps rewire the brain. You don't know it. It's happening in the background, the same way you use a computer. I'm older, so I remember the DOS days, right? When you had to switch disks and you would type in CD / etc. In order to change from one drive to another. And then there was Windows. And you didn't have to know any of the language behind the programs of the computer. They would just operate, and you would just see Windows pop up, and the next thing you knew, you had all of the different programs that we had that operated seamlessly without you having to understand any of the programming. How convenient. Well, the brain works the same way. We don't understand all of the programming that's going on up there, and yet all of these things, these processes happen, and we're not really aware of how that works. We're going to talk a lot about that because we've broken down how this stuff works, and we can talk about how the neuroscience and even the psychology and our Christian faith all come together. They're all talking about the same sorts of things, but from different vantage points and with different language. So, what we want to do is learn to interpret these different languages so that we have one kind of unified theory of what it means to be a human being, how human beings process things, what we mean when we talk about sin or addiction. Here's the thing: sin and addiction both share the same kinds of neural functions and systems, right? And so they operate very much the same way. What we're going to discover is that all of the things that we don't want to do, that we do, whether it's something very dramatic like alcoholism or some other addiction, or things that are less apparent and less ugly, but just as destructive, like overwhelm, like when we feel completely overwhelmed by things and we stall and we can't move forward. All of this stuff, this is all governed by the same mechanisms. And it would be wrong for us to reduce these just to neural mechanisms, in other words, things that are going on in the brain, or psychological mechanisms. What we have to begin to realize, and what we're going to discover on this channel, is that a human being is one psychosomatic spiritual whole. In other words, psychosomatic, mind or spirit, and soma, body, and the spirit. This is all the same thing. I mean, there's a little bit of redundancy in the language there, but for the purpose of the way we talk about things, that's the way I'm going to express it. These are all one thing, just different facets of the same human person. And so what we want to do is we want to begin to look at this stuff from the perspective of a Christian anthropology. That's kind of important. Most of the time when we talk about maybe neuroscience or psychology, we're not starting from a Christian anthropology. In other words, a Christian understanding of the human person, of how a human person is made or how a human person functions. That's a Christian anthropology. We want to look at, from a Christian perspective, a biblical perspective, what it means to be a human being. Once we begin to do that, we begin to understand the different problems that we're working with and why it's so difficult for us to change. The light begins to go on and we begin to go, oh, now I understand why I feel, for example, trauma so deeply. What we begin to realize is that the way human beings are made, this Christian anthropology, hinges or rests upon what we call the imago Dei, the image of God, the divine image. And it references Genesis, when God made Adam and Eve. And it says he made them, man and woman, in his own image. We are image bearers. But that divine image, that divine imprint, the nature of God that lies within us, that has been imprinted upon us, the pattern of God that we have been made after, has been damaged. It was damaged at the fall of our first father and mother, Adam and Eve. And whether or not we want to take that literally or not actually doesn't even matter here. And I probably created distress by just saying that one thing, but I've just triggered you. Ha ha. But we'll get to that. We'll get to those kinds of questions. So don't get hung up on that. But the reality is that our first father and mother, Adam and Eve, fell. And there's something very interesting that happened with that. And so, we want to talk about all of these things, right? The image of God in us has fallen. In other words, it's fallen from what it's supposed to be, its full realization and full potential, as being made in the image and likeness of God. Obviously, we're not talking about how many fingers and toes we have and what our facial features are like. When we talk about the image of God, we're not talking about that stuff. We're talking about something else. We're talking about our incorporeal, invisible, spiritual nature. Incorporeal means without a body, or our bodiless personhood. What exists beyond or after the body, right? So all of these things, this image of God that's stamped within our spirit, this is imperishable. This is what the fathers of the church say. It is imperishable. It cannot be destroyed, but it can be marred. It can be wounded. It can be inhibited and darkened. And this is what we discover. What we are working with is a darkened mind, an inhibited nature, a nature that's broken and fallen and less than what it ought to be. Christ came to restore this in us. And this is the beginning of how we begin to, this is the beginning of not doing the things that we don't want to do. We need Christ in us. We need that restoration of our humanity to reinitiate that process in us, kind of like rebooting a computer, right? Christ came, took on human flesh. He was fully God and fully man. He came, he took on human flesh to reboot our humanity. God re-entered our humanity and then sanctified it. And in doing so, that kind of cascades out to everyone who believes. So, why do you keep doing the things that you do? Well, there's a lot behind that. We're going to talk about the theology of it. We're going to talk maybe about a little bit of the psychology of it. We're going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience behind that. But then we're going to talk about the practices and the practical things that we could do to overcome those. So I hope you stick around for the stuff that comes next. Bye.